This series of verses takes place in a rather action-packed chapter. So those who have been following along, you'll know. The chapter itself is all about this kind of protracted battle or warfare between the demigods and the demons. And in a very typical sort of Bhagavatam fashion, there's a little bit of subversion going on because when we talk about the demons, we're also speaking about personalities like Bali Maharaj, who are actually great devotees. Similarly, in the Bhagavatam, and there's some reference to it here, Indra is kind of calling back to the great battle with Vritrasura. So again, another example of a great devotee who, at least according to a kind of an external calculation, is on the side of the bad guys. So the Bhagavatam does something very interesting there. But in these verses, there's a little kind of, we get a glimpse into a story within the story. And this is the story of Indra's difficulty in killing Namuchi and how eventually this difficulty is overcome. And so there's not so much material here, but what I'd like to do is I'd like to take these handful of verses and this short purport to explore how this might be a very instructive story for us. That even in this little slice, this little glimpse of what's going on with Indra and with this challenge that he has, that there's lessons for us, there's lessons for sadhakas, that the Bhagavatam is actually speaking to us. When we first encounter, in this series of verses at least, when we encounter Indra, he is in this moment of reflection. Sometimes in the Bhagavatam and in other Puranic stories, Indra is depicted as being, often he's instructive to us in his, in showing us what not to do as far as things like arrogance or becoming enamored with prestige or envy or things like this. He's a great soul. It's a great position, and the personality that occupies that position is undoubtedly a very, very great, accomplished, praiseworthy personality. And at the same time, the Bhagavatam and other texts like it, but especially the Bhagavatam, are not shy about showing this great personality's shortcomings, or the way that even in subtle ways they can become sidetracked by ego, by name, fame, prestige, even in the execution of their service. So even in the process of their seva, which for the devatas, their seva is things like this. Even fighting with the demons in one sense is part of their seva. Thankfully, it's not a seva that most of us have to endure, but we can appreciate that it's not just random activity they're performing; it's their service. So generally, we see characters like Indra, personalities like Indra, can often teach us by, we see their shortcomings and then we think, okay, how can I not fall into that same trap? Here, the lesson is a little bit different, because here we see Indra in kind of an uncharacteristically reflective mood. He's actually, as one of the texts describe, he is, Shukadev Goswami says, the morose Indra, Prabhupada translates it as, the morose Indra was lamenting in this way. So this is Indra in this kind of, we find him in this mood of lamentation. We find him in this mood of reflection. And while like lamenting and reflecting, he is thinking about the past. So lamentation is often linked to the past. It's said sometimes that lamentation is the mind traveling to the past, and then the mind travels to the future, and that is like hankering. So often you see lamentation and hankering are considered kind of opposite pairs, but they're like, you can say, two sides of the same coin, because the mind, the memories, the emotions, the heart, everything is is being linked to the past or the future, but it kind of takes us out of the present. Anyway, that's a slightly different lesson. But the point is, lamentation, in the mood of lamentation, we often travel to the past mentally. And so we see Indra doing this. Indra is going to the past and he's thinking, well, in the past, he's kind of reflecting, and perhaps even in a mood of a little bit of not sarcasm exactly, but kind of in this very emotional, almost like self-deprecating state. He's saying, in the past, this thunderbolt was able to do amazing things. That in the past, when mountains were causing problems, I was able to use this thunderbolt to cut the wings of these mountains and curb their pride and curb their destructive tendencies, right? So I was able to protect others and to overcome, like in kind of everyday language. If you think about something that's so difficult to overcome, usually the imagery is given of a mountain. But here, Indra's thunderbolt was able to overcome not just any old mountain, but mountains that, according to the text at least, were flying with wings. So Indra was so powerful. He's reflecting, I was so powerful, my thunderbolt was so powerful that I could easily cut off the wings and curb the pride and overcome these mountains. What to speak of mountains? Actually, so many demons, so many enemies, those who underwent austerities and had supernatural protective powers. And here he gives a specific example of Vritrasura, who we know from the Bhagavatam. Vritrasura is one of the most powerful, physically powerful, but also emotionally and spiritually powerful beings, right? Born of this, of the sacrificial fire, born of austerities that were undergone by powerful brahmanas. Stalwarts like Vritrasura, Indra is saying, I was able to overcome them. Those personalities, no other weapon could touch them, but my thunderbolt severed their heads from their bodies. My thunderbolt was able to defeat them. Actually, this is the story of Indra's thunderbolt. It's a whole other story, right? But how Indra, what Indra's thunderbolt, what is the power of that weapon? So Indra is kind of reflecting, how powerful am I? How powerful was my weapons? But not in a boastful spirit. He's actually reflecting in the spirit of lamentation, because he's saying, now this same Indra, I'm the same Indra, this thunderbolt is the same thunderbolt, but now somehow or other, this thunderbolt, which used to be like a Brahmastra, has now become like an ordinary rod. It's now, practically speaking, it's like a useless stick. So what's the point of even holding it? This is like some deep lamentation. This is really Indra in a very, we can say, very painful situation, but also a very humbled situation. And so what I want to suggest is that we can look at this episode, and we can look at particularly this part of this episode as very instructive for us, because Indra is modeling for us in one way. He's modeling for us a kind of what it's like to be humbled. If we think back in our own lives, or maybe even a situation that we're dealing with right now, I know right now I won't go into details, but I'm in the midst of a certain situation which is causing quite a bit of stress. Sometimes in those situations, we still feel like we can hold on to some sense of control. We still feel like, okay, well, the situation is bad, but still, I have such and such power, or I just need to outsmart my opponent, right? Like, I'm in a situation right now that involves a little bit of a kind of a back and forth that feels a little bit like, a kind of a battle of wits, a battle of the mind, a kind of an argument back and forth. Not exactly like that, but something like that. And if I'm being honest, there's a part of me that's really trying to take shelter of my cleverness, of my intelligence, right? I don't have many weapons, but somehow or other, I have this, I won't even say ability, but I have this inclination towards using words and making arguments. So like that, at least for myself, I'm not going to speak for anyone else, but for myself, it's very easy for me to lean into that tendency to take shelter of that skill set or those, you know, quote unquote weapons at my disposal. But when the situation really gets bad, or when the situation, not just bad, but when the situation is such that it becomes really clear to me and maybe clear to everyone around me, which is even more humbling, but it becomes really clear to me that that same skill set that served me so well in other settings, that same skill set that brought me victory or brought me comfort or brought me, you know, solace in other situations, that same skill set, practically speaking, is useless now. It doesn't take away from the accomplishments of the past, but it humbles me. It humbles me in a couple of ways. For one thing, it really makes me question, how powerful am I actually? Right? How much, you know, is it about me and my skills and my abilities and my prowess? And even that skill set, whose skill set is that? Who really possesses it? So on the one hand, it's humbling because it makes me question, you know, am I really the powerful one? Was it really me, or was it something or someone? Through the lens of bhakti, we can say someone, really, Krishna working through me, right? Was it Krishna empowering me? In the past, I was able to do it. Why am I hitting a brick wall now, right? So that can open up for us, that can make us miserable. But if we're open to it, as Indra seems to be modeling for us a little bit here, we can really reflect and we can say, what's going on here? Well, I was powerful in the past, I thought, but now somehow it's not working for me. So maybe it wasn't me, right? From the standpoint of a devotee, we can try to go in the direction of really introspecting and thinking, who was it that was actually working, that was so powerful? So that's one way of looking at it. A related point is we can also ask ourselves, okay, I thought I had this skill set. I thought that was mine. I thought that was like my weapon in my hand, right? Who does it actually belong to? And so there's this reframing that can take place where I thought the thunderbolt was mine, you know, whatever the thunderbolt is in our own lives. But then I reflect and I realize, oh, this thunderbolt, actually, I didn't create it. I got to hold it for a little while. I got to use it as long as, you know, Krishna empowered me and it was Krishna's will for me to use it. But right now, it's clear to me that it's not actually mine, that it's on loan, or we can say maybe it was gifted to me, it was graced. So these are difficult. I mean, it's easy to talk about, but when we're in the midst of the situation, being humbled in that way doesn't feel good, and especially when there's some kind of audience. For those of us who are a little bit more like myself, who our psychology is a little bit more on perception and how we're seen, and we want to be seen as very powerful and together, you know, having our stuff together, being very smart, being very well spoken, whatever. It's embarrassing to have our shortcomings and our weaknesses, you know, on display. And at the same time, it can be incredibly, incredibly powerful for our growth. That in that moment of being humbled, in that lamentation, there is a possibility for grace, that Krishna can actually, Krishna is so pleased to see us embracing that being humbled. So we can be humbled and then go to a place of being humiliated, or we can take that situation of being humbled and take it as a pathway to humility. Being humbled, it's not exactly the same thing as cultivating humility, but it can be it can open the door to intentionally cultivating humility for us. Here we're seeing this in Indra. Another great example of this is in the Bhagavad Gita, in the story of, actually in the way that the Gita even begins and unfolds. Many of the classical Vedantic commentators, they argue that the Gita proper actually begins with one verse in the second chapter. I believe it's 2:7. And the verse goes, Karpanya dosho pahata svabhava. Prachami tvam dharma samuda chetaha. Yashreyacham nishitam bruhitan me shishyasteham shadimam tvam prapannam. Where Arjuna says, I'll paraphrase, he says that I'm Krishna now. He gives all his arguments for why he won't, why he feels that he can't fight. But at this pivotal point in the beginning of the second chapter, in this verse, Arjuna says, Krishna, now I admit to you that I am weak. I'm weak like a miser who has a great storehouse of wealth, but is not accessing it, is not able to access it, right? Karpanya, I'm like a miser. And in that miserly weakness, he says, I've forgotten dharma. I've forgotten who I am. I've forgotten what is my own dharma and who I am. And in this state of mind, he says, I'm turning to you. I'm surrendering to you. I'm accepting you as my teacher, as my guide. I'm now just take me as your student. No longer look at me as your friend or as the warrior on this chariot. Accept me as just your student, fallen at your feet, and instruct me. You tell me for sure what is real shreyas, what is really best for me. That's incredibly humbling. We read that verse and we read the Gita, and sometimes we think of it as like, oh, what a beautiful thing. It's so nice. You know, Arjuna turns to Krishna, Krishna speaks, and it is nice. But if we try to put ourselves in Arjuna's shoes or here in Indra's shoes, it's intense to be someone that is ordinarily very powerful, and yet to have to come to this realization that actually I'm weak. I need help. I can't do it on my own. But that admission of weakness, that lamentation, that opens the door to Krishna's grace. That opens the door to being led, being guided. And here we see, again, practically speaking, it happens in a slightly different form, but the same thing happens. Shukadev Goswami says when the morose Indra was lamenting in this way, usually lamentation is considered a fault, right? Krishna says over and over again in the Gita, in at least two references that I can think of, right? Brahma Bhuta Prasanatma, na shochati na kankshati. Na shochati. So shochati means, it's a synonym here. There's a different word used, Vishidantam, but it's a synonym. Vishidantam also ends up in the Bhagavad Gita. It's also used for lamentation. So whatever word we use, lamentation and then kankshati, hankering. Both of these are considered to be something that a devotee is supposed to be free of. But we see that here lamentation has a purpose. Lamentation opens the doorway to humility. And so this is what happens. The morose Indra is lamenting in this way. He's humbled. And in this mood, it's almost like this mood churns out, or it puts Indra in the best possible position so that when this divine unembodied voice, what Prabhupada translates as this ominous unembodied voice, speaks from the sky, then Indra is ready to listen. And what the voice tells Indra is, it's very interesting. The voice tells Indra that the demon cannot be killed by anything moist or dry, and invites Indra to think of another way. It's really interesting here, and I was thinking about this last night as I was rereading these verses, that in one sense, that unembodied voice could have just easily told Indra, make a weapon out of foam and kill Namuchi with that weapon. But instead, this voice that I believe, someone can correct me, but I believe we can, voices in some way or another is Vishnu, Krishna himself, or is, divine providence. Somehow there is described as his divine voice. So this Daivim Giram. This divine voice could have very easily just given Indra the answer, but instead the voice gives Indra kind of a hint, an insight, and says, well, you know, think about this. I'll give you, it's almost like, you know, a parent sometimes wants the child to discover the answer, but they also want to help the child, you know, set the child on the right track. So they say, well, I won't tell you, but I'll give you a hint. You know, think of this. Are you thinking of this? It's not quite giving them the answer, but it's equipping them to think in the right way. And quite, I think, you know, in this really kind of cool, like remarkable way, the voice does that. The voice tells Indra to think about the fact that the demon can't be killed by anything moist or dry, and then invites Indra to kind of figure it out for himself. And what Indra does is he meditates, and from his meditation, it's not entirely clear, but the way I read this is from his meditation, or in his meditation, he sees, it's revealed to him, he understands that foam is the key here. And I think this is also very instructive because, again, you know, every situation is different, but in some situations when we open ourselves up, when we humble ourselves and we admit to Krishna in this mood of lamentation that I can't do it on my own, Krishna, I need your help, I need your guidance, I can't figure it out. Sometimes, you know, Krishna may reveal the answer to us in a very explicit way, in a dream, or, you know, we might even hear a voice or something like that, or we might read something in Shastra that's really directly answers our question, or the Guru or other, you know, great Vaishnavas, Krishna may speak through them and give us the answer that way explicitly. So that definitely happens. But I know for myself at least, and I imagine this is the case for many of us, often it doesn't quite happen in that way. It happens in the way that we reflect on the problem. And in that humbled mood, in that mood of meditating, perhaps it's not said here, but we can add to this praying. Perhaps we pray. Inspiration, after we do that, inspiration comes from within. And we can look at that in an impersonal way and say, oh, well, the answer was within you all the time and it's just you. But I think, you know, looking at this from the perspective of kind of Bhakti Tattva, we can understand that if Krishna can appear in all these different ways, then Krishna can certainly appear as inspiration within our own hearts or minds. That Krishna can appear as he says in the Gita, as the intelligence of the intelligent, as the strength of the strong, as the abilities in all people. We read that, and sometimes we think of it in terms of others. But if it's true of others, then it's true of ourselves also. Not that, you know, not that should make us proud or arrogant in any way, but we should appreciate that Krishna, if he wants to, he can appear as my intelligence. And if he wants to, he can appear as my power and my strength, what I call my power and my strength, but he can reveal himself to me in that way internally. And in one sense, we see that happening here with Indra, that the inspiration comes once Indra is humbled, the inspiration comes from within, that Krishna speaks to him from within, animates him from within, and gives him this gift of insight into, it's a little funny, but into foam. And that brings us, I think, to the final, the final sort of instructive piece to this short episode. And then I'd love to open it up for some questions or comments. But the last thing I'll say here is that it's also, I think, very instructive that the answer in this case is something like foam, which I'll just be very kind of blunt about it. It may seem like a really kind of a strange thing, like foam. They made a weapon out of foam. It just seems like very atypical, right? It just kind of like almost like, if I can, you know, pardon my using this expression, but it just seems like really weird. Like it's like a weird thing in the Bhagavatam that there's this weapon made out of foam. But I think there's also something really instructive here, because the foam in this case is just another expression of when Krishna wants to be really clever, when Krishna wants to be really, no one can outsmart Krishna. No set of circumstances can override or can kind of stump, like to use this expression, can stump Krishna. If Krishna wants to get around something, he will get around it. we see this time and time again, and there's so many examples of this. The example that comes to my mind is very much the story of Hiranyakashipu and Narsingadev, where Hiranyakashipu really thought, as the demons often do, that through very careful selection, right? It's almost like Hiranyakashipu had like an attorney, a lawyer by his side to say, like, put in this clause, put in that clause, right? Not inside, not outside, not in this way, not in that way, not by this, not by that, right? Trying to cover all your bases, to use that idiom. And what does Vishnu do? What does Krishna do in that story? What does Nrsingadev do? He simultaneously defeats Hiranyakashipu while protecting Prahlad, while honoring the boons given by Brahma. So Brahma, no fault can be given to Brahma, or there's no, there's no stain on Brahma's character. He does all of that, and he puts on a show. He does it in such this glorious, dramatic, kind of unusual way that it like creates this big drama that, so many millennia later, we're still talking about. It's still inspiring so much art and iconography. If you go and throughout India, especially South India, there's so many beautiful depictions, right? In sculpture, in dance, in drama, in artwork and paintings, right? So if Krishna wants to, he can accomplish so many things in one unusual move. And here, there's this really, you might think like unusual benediction of not being killed by anything moist or dry. You might think, okay, covering the bases, what, that must cover everything. And Krishna says, well, what about foam? And I mean, it's charming, and it should be. In the Bhagavatam, part of the Bhagavatam is that it awakens our propensity to appreciate and marvel at and be charmed by Krishna and his cleverness, right? There's a sweetness to it that Krishna, and the protection of his devotees, he can do anything, and he can come up with any kind of, clever, not just clever in a snarky sense, but really like intelligent, out of the box thinking, right? There's something that's very attractive about out of the box thinking. But it also, I think, is so it's charming, but it also is a reminder to us that even in our own lives, in situations that seem very cut and dry, that seem very black and white, that seem very rigidly impossible, and we come up against a situation that's like, there's just no way out. There's no way, there's no solution to this. We can choose to see it in that way and choose to see through the lens of limitation, or we can, as difficult as it may be, humble ourselves, reflect, meditate, and open ourselves up to the possibility that Krishna can make the impossible possible. Krishna can find that liminal space that seems to us to be, an impossibility. That Krishna is a source of infinite possibility, even in the face of apparent impossibility. So those are some, I thought, kind of takeaway points that might be instructive for us from this. I know we have a few minutes, if I'm not mistaken, we have a few minutes before we have to conclude at 8. Are there any questions? Would anyone like to share their own reflections, realizations on this section? Happy to open it up.
Thank you, Venkata Bhatta. It was really an amazing class, how you shared about turning to Krishna even in the moments of difficulty, and when we feel we are like very extremely humble, even we can use those situations to turn to Krishna. I really have questions. However, first I will ask other participants, if any of them, they have any questions, they can unmute themselves and ask.
Haribol, hello. Hi. First of all, wonderful, wonderful class. Thank you so much. I always get so much out of whenever you speak. I had 2 really quick points I just wanted to share. One is that Danyadhara Maharaj was recently speaking about how regret is such a useful tool and can be the beginning of the spiritual life. And he was talking about sometimes we don't regret enough. And it really feels like Indra is regretting enough so that this can be a springboard, as Maharaj, I think, put it, to, you know, to his getting this clarity. So I really just love that point, the way you put it. And then also I was thinking that it's different being humbled and being humiliated. I feel like being humbled is following that proper, really our proper way of being, and humiliated is when we sort of go to a place where it doesn't really do any good. Krishna doesn't humiliate us. He doesn't smash us down so that we have no faith to get back up, but he does humble us. And as you were speaking, I was thinking those are two very different ways. To quote Adi, Krishna is so wonderful that he humbles us, but he always gives us a faith and a way to pick ourselves up, so he doesn't humiliate us because he loves us so.
Beautiful. Thank you. Thank you so much. Yeah, one thing that I'll just add to that, although it's what you said is just, you know, perfect. But I'd forgotten to say this earlier, that, you know, the problem is not so much the regret or the lamentation. That, in one sense, is and should be, as Dharmadhar Maharaj makes the point that you're citing, should be kind of natural. The problem is often when we get stuck there. So if we're stuck in a place of lamentation, regret, that doesn't allow us to move forward, to accept the gifts of Krishna in our life and the way to kind of rebuild us, so to speak, that can then end up becoming very unhealthy for us, you know, emotionally and spiritually. But yes, thank you so much, Jayaji. Thank you.
Hare Krishna. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Can you say your name for me, please?
It's Angelika.
Angelika.
Yes. So the point that was brought up that really I think is very instructive to me is that idea of how can we almost offer and like all of our feelings and experiences to take shelter of Krishna more. And I was reflecting on how, you know, lamentation is being stuck in the past and hankering is being kind of stuck in the future. But, you know, there's just a very small, tiny amount of time when I am present at all, if there's any throughout the day or night. And so I'm just wondering, how can I actually take shelter of Krishna in hankering and lamentation?
Yeah, it's a great question. I would love to hear others' thoughts. For myself, I'll just answer quickly in one way. One thing that I've been reflecting on recently and taking a lot of inspiration from Sachinandan Swami's approach to this is that our spiritual practices, and particularly our chanting, is a very powerful practice of helping us to be in the present. It's a kind of a practice of radical presence, because when we're chanting attentively, which is a whole other thing, right? That's where the challenge really lies. And we're choosing not to take our chanting as just kind of a rote, like letting the mind wander, but we're choosing to try to be present to Krishna in his name. In one sense, it's building up that skill of being present to Krishna in the moment. So if we can do that in our chanting, at least one thing I'm reflecting on, but I would love to hear what others think, that helps us to be able to be present, be in the present moment, like just even in the midst of the moment, like what is Krishna trying to tell me right now? Where is Krishna in this right now?